If you've clicked on this video, I'm going to save us both some trouble and assume you've already seen part 1 of this little mini-series and know what we're doing here. But just in case you've skipped to this part specifically to see my terrible thoughts on your favorite little sinner, or hell, even your least favorite, I'm going through every ID in the game, briefly giving my thoughts on them from an art, animation, sprite, lore, gameplay, and whatever other biased perspective I choose to bring up per ID, and giving them a relatively arbitrary ranking on a tier list that will then be taken severely out of context online, continually, over and over again. Part of the reason I'm keeping this intro so short is because going into this video, I knew my thoughts on the latter half of the Sinner IDs would require at least a little bit more time, because a lot of these IDs have some real stories associated with them, or are just some of my favorites and least favorites in the game. We only had one F-tier ID in the last video, but I assure you that will be a bit different this time around. As a reminder, we won't be covering the base IDs, since they aren't really IDs in the traditional sense anyways, and we already have a full inventory slot in Minecraft worth of IDs to cover. One last thing before we get into it, quite a few people in the comments last time asked me about doing an ego version of this video. And while I wasn't planning on doing one initially, I'm going to pull a classic YouTuber maneuver and say that if this video gets, let's say, 8,000 likes, I'll be sure to get that out sometime in the future. Okay, and now that I can cross off set a like goal in a YouTube video off my bucket list, it's time to buckle in for what is surely a feature-length film's worth of yapping about a mobile gacha game. I think it's for the best that I preface the first segment of this video by saying I have a terrible Heathcliff bias, which is to say, he is my favorite sinner. And while that certainly gives bonus points from a characterization perspective in most of these ID's uptie stories, Heathcliff still has some duds. And a perfect example of that is Heathcliff. While Heathcliff is my favorite sinner nowadays, he wasn't at the time of Limbus's release. So my opinion on Heathcliff wasn't cushioned by my favorite sinner biases, which is a big problem when you're Heathcliff and you were utterly abysmal on launch. A lot of you may not know or remember a time where Heathcliff uptie 3 was the norm. But oh my god. Keep in mind, a below 25% HP conditional is still bad by today's standards, where unbreakable coins make taking damage not as much of a nuisance as it used to be. How bad was it before? Basically fucking impossible. Since if you're getting to below 25% HP, it's more likely you've been straight up murdered rather than just barely hanging on and able to recover, much less attack. That aside, his payoffs were terrible. But really, there's not much more to say about this version of Heathcliff, because the modern version is at least interesting, being part of the very exclusive Attack Weight Club, and also one of 2 real IDs in the game. Though I promise I will finally go on a real spiel about the IDs and their awkward place in Limbus when we get to the best of them. But for now, I do have to say that despite most launch IDs having a pretty big disadvantage from an art and sprite perspective, Heathcliff still holds up really well in those departments. His uptie 1 art is one of the best ones in the game for showing off sinner dynamics within these mirror worlds. Really, any Heathcliff ID where he's doing this cocky smile during one of the animations is gonna rank pretty high for me, since there's something satisfying about Heathcliff having a good time wrecking shit, even if he is canonically really bad at what his job should be. Yes, I did say that this ID is one of Heathcliff's duds. A miss, if you will. And also yes, he is still a B-tier ID to me. This is the lowest ranking a Heathcliff ID will be getting. I am not sorry. Rabbit Heathcliff is a classic. Perhaps a bit too classic, in fact. From the launch of Limbus to right around Corp Sinclair's release, Rabbit Heathcliff, undeniably, was the strongest ID in the game. And while his fragile application is still incredibly valuable, it's insane that I can pretty confidently say that Rabbit Heathcliff has been outgunned by other IDs in the most literal sense. Because of his consistent and unending presence in the community and his reputation, my opinion of him has suffered due to pure overexposure to his constant cries of "Gam Chang." While it could be as simple as that for any other ID, He is a part of R-Corp, and R-Corp, especially the Rabbit team, is one of my favorite parts of the Project Moon universe, so looking back on him in retrospect and not solely focusing on gameplay, even if I'm much more positive on him than I otherwise would have been, I can't help but wish that a Rabbit ID would have been a bit more interesting kit-wise. And hey, maybe that's something to look forward to in an Uptie 5, since making Rabbit Heathcliff function like full-stop Hong Lu would maybe make him among my favorites, just because I really like the concept of dual-wielding the gun and the knife. Also, he is implied to be hopped up on some kind of something in his Uptie story, which makes his stupid little rabbit puns that he does make a lot more sense and be a bit more charming when you consider he probably isn't all there mentally whenever he's using this ID. N-Corp Heathcliff is the ID that I focused my third ever video around. And it's funny looking back on it, where I praise his pretty good numbers with this Uptie 4 buff via his passive, which was new at the time, since, yeah, these are really just okay. But the real issue is needing 3 other N-Corp IDs so he can actually utilize this passive, but alas, 4 N-Corp IDs on one team is a pretty tough ask, and that is putting it very lightly. I've made it well known that I do not like the N-Corp Inquisitor armor, and while I am still not a huge fan of it here, there's something about the way Heathcliff is hiding his mouth and his hair is dyed, like instead of going on a righteous heretic slaying crusade, he's taking a detour crusade to a Hot Topic in order to get Hazbin Hotel merchandise. I don't know what to say. It's charming. Especially considering he is the most reluctant member of N-Corp out of the 6 IDs we have, and that is indeed reflected in his goofy, half-hearted skill names. Really, I just feel bad for N-Corp Heathcliff, especially since for some reason he was treated like he was absolutely terrible when he was released, and I really have no clue why, besides that he was completely overshadowed by N-Faust, and you know what, at least over 2 years after his release, N-Cliff gets his vengeance by ranking 1 tier higher on the Silly Cube Man's personal opinion tier list. What a high honor. Sunshower Heathcliff. Ugh. It is tempting to ramble for long enough to justify an entirely new video, but I'm gonna keep it brief, despite Sunshower Heathcliff undoubtedly having one of the most complicated histories of any single ID in Limbus Company. Now, when I say complicated, most of it is bad. Hell, some of it is very bad. Just look at his numbers for the most tragic part, but it is still a history. And I have to respect Sunshower Heathcliff for still being one of only 2 fully negative sanity IDs. It is crazy to me that we are approaching 2 years since our last ID with fully negative coin skills, but I think the execution and subsequent reception to this ID is a really big factor in that. Just before Sunshower Heathcliff's release, Project Moon fully intended on changing how sanity gain and sanity loss works, heavily nerfing the sanity gain and making it actually possible to lose sanity outside of ego usage. This was met with immediate backlash and was reverted, for good reason in my opinion, but it's very clear that Sunshower Heathcliff was designed with this different sanity system in mind. Sunshower released in an underpowered state, to say the least. Compared to Sinclair, it shouldn't be hard to see why Sunshower Heathcliff, to put it lightly, sucks ass. Would this more favorable sanity system have saved him? I doubt it. But it certainly would have helped his downside of gaining too much sanity from winning clashes, if nothing else. The gameplay aspect of Sunshower is definitely the most convoluted thing about him, but from an art and animation standpoint, this ID was destined to be something greater than he is now, and even people who hate Sunshower do have to admit his animations are good, and most especially, they are a step above what was being released, and in my opinion, this was the start of the trend for ID animations to not just be good, but usually be great, or at least a lot more creative than before. The way I see it, that's the appeal of this ID. He set a creativity standard, and it's just a real shame that the quality present there didn't end up translating into intuitive viability for his kit. 7 Association Heathcliff is easily among my favorite IDs in terms of lore. The fact that this Heathcliff is from a mirror world where he actually feels like he's proving himself in something other than being destructive is wholesome. Even if he's still learning how to actually do forensics and detective work, it proves that he's genuinely very capable if he's not dismissed as a brute with an affinity for smashing shit and nothing else. I don't actually have many other opinions on him. His kit is just pretty good, his animations are fun, I do especially love the papers flying everywhere with his skill 3, but the main draw of this ID is just how fun the concept is, and lucky for him, I absolutely love the concept of the quote-unquote dumb detective. If you saw the tier list at the end of the last video, or I guess the beginning of this one, but that's cheating, you'll know there was a blank space at the top reserved for my absolute favorite ID in the game. And it should be no real surprise that it's a Heathcliff ID, and now that I have an excuse to, I can finally talk at length about everything I adore about Harpooner Heathcliff. First of all, this ID's art is just amazing. The Uptie 1 art and acquisition animation really stand out, and the Uptie 3 art, even though it's not an action shot where he's using his skill 3, like most other 3-star Uptie 3 arts, there's a very solemn vibe to it. And that's another thing I like about this ID. Most Heathcliff IDs either show Heathcliff at his most confident, or his lowest points. And while I want nothing but the best for our dear Heathcliff, his character was literally designed to be doomed by the narrative by Emily Bronte 178 years ago. So it's no wonder that his best IDs are when he is unfortunately put through as much emotional turmoil as possible. While I could talk more about his lore and certain Canto 5 and Canto 6 events that make me enjoy him even more, I do want to keep this series spoiler-free as possible, which some people seem to be unable to understand, and Harpooner Heathcliff's kit is probably the main draw for me anyways, since the bruiser formula that Sunjower Heathcliff attempted is perfected here. No protection this time around, just one high up stagger threshold, and massive rewards for being hit. There's something about eating one slash skill with a Sin Affinity Heathcliff is fatal to, and then whoop-de-doo, after he's staggered and taken more damage, you are suddenly dealing 60% more damage. It makes his gameplay loop pretty unique, especially considering how most IDs without proper coin power conditionals feel pretty bad nowadays, but Harpooner still stands the test of time, I think. Now, is all of that my bias towards him? No, just a good majority of it, I think. Somewhat unrelated to all of that, this bleed count conditional is really interesting, working off of current bleed potency alongside his poise potency conditional to inflict a bunch of bleed count. No ID since his release has really had the same tanking equals literal extra damage percentage philosophy, and it's the main example of tanking equaling extra damage that actually feels good, at least to me. It's a shame we've hit the absolute peak this early into the video, but don't worry, there's still plenty of interesting IDs to talk about going forward, whether that be for the best or for the worst, but it's not getting any better than this. Oofy Heathcliff, wow, yay. Why does the faction whose primary business is making sure contracts get fulfilled and literally executing people if they do not comply use Tremor as their status of choice, for one, and two, not have any on-kill effects with their skills? Before he released, I assumed he would be paralyzed, bleed, and some bind, maybe. Sort of like the chef IDs, since those guys also do, executions of sorts. But instead, he was the first instance of amplitude conversion, which is a good and fun game mechanic, but for it to debut on an Oofy ID is kinda unexpected when you consider their lore. And I hope I'm not alone in being a little bit bothered by that. Outside of that gripe, meh. He's a very basic ID, which there's nothing inherently wrong with, but I don't think Tremor IDs are necessarily the best ones to be this basic, considering the archetype is known to struggle without its extra mechanics, and yes, I know, he literally introduced the extra mechanic that would later make Tremor shine, but the rest of his kit is really bare minimum in exchange, and so I can't really end up loving him, so in the end I just like him a very normal amount. For a Heathcliff ID, which is to say, he's still a B tier. Multicrack Heathcliff feels like an ID that was made to specifically give two statuses that had only one or two IDs that inflicted them, an actual modern ID that could also apply them, those being HP Healing Down and Blunt Fragility. Before Multicrack Heathcliff, HP Healing Down was exclusive to Chef Ryoshu, and Blunt Fragility was only on Zwei Sinclair, and even then not really, and base Ishmael, who is almost always immediately replaced by Ishmael by like 90% of Limbus players. I'm not going to act like these are super impactful debuffs. Yes, HP healing down did get an extra use case immediately after I called it worthless in the last video, but it is still undeniably bad. Multicrack Heathcliff himself is basically just Multicrack Faust, but kinda cooler. Outside of having a tasteful face mask compared to Faust's half face, the fact that he's the only one to inflict photoelectricity, which is a buff that actually makes a charge team feel like a team, makes him way more mechanically interesting than Multicrack Faust, since all she does is ramp up via charge potency, and Heathcliff also does that. Without photoelectricity, and even with charge barrier and certain charge count spreading ego, a charge team just feels like guys who happen to have charge that ended up in the same place. Even if he's not the best ID, his numbers are damn good for a 2-star once you've ramped up, and he ties together a team that really needed some team support. Wild Hunt Heathcliff. There's a lot to say here, and I really do mean a lot. This was our first ID that ever got a kit preview before the actual kit preview live on a stream. And while it did technically take away some stuff from the surprise of his kit when it initially came out, holy god, did Wild Hunt Heathcliff still bring so much innovation to Limbus. Without him, the clashable counter that we see so much nowadays would still just be a leftover asset from Ruina. Not to mention his unique panic type, coffin stacking mechanic, and everyone's favorite, his surprisingly good sinking support passive. Okay, fine, yeah, I mean, the horse. Yes, Dawn Office Sinclair did do it before him, but Wild Hunt Heathcliff does the form change thing cooler, just because the sheer size difference between him and every other ID in the game makes him stand out so much more. I mean, not to mention the fact that he just summons phantoms of other IDs to fight for him in several of his skills, and any video containing his skill 3 animations immediately gets about 10 times harder to watch at nighttime. Speaking of his skill 3, I think Lament, Mourn, and Despair is up there for one of my favorite skills in the game. Even if it is a pretty basic skill to like, just because, come on, obviously, it's like saying your favorite skill is Quick Suppression. However, the fact that this is one of the few skills in the game you can have semi-on-demand is insane, and killing with either of its 2 coins is immensely satisfying, especially considering how much the target's stagger threshold can be raised by the first coin. I don't love the 14 base roll on the skill 2, just because 16 is far and away the standard, and yes, he does get 2 Clash Power up eventually to meet the standard, but his ramp up takes a while, blah blah blah, whatever, man, who actually cares? He lasts like a lunatic when you click on him, and he's one of the coolest looking IDs in the game, if not my favorite ID from a purely visual standpoint. He's also got 2 uptie stories for before and after Canto 6, which is absolutely the same treatment Manager Dawn deserved, but I guess Heathcliff just stays fucking winning. Because the fact he has 2 different uptie stories, and the reason why, really ties this ID nicely together. What a shock! Another Heathcliff ID in the S tier. If you managed to make it to the end of the Honglu section in the last video, you'd know that Full Stop Office was the faction I wanted the most in the game before the 5th Walpurgis Nacht rolled around. Since Heathcliff is my favorite sinner, you get an ID that combines everything I could ever want from Limbus right here. A completely different hairstyle for an ID, Heathcliff, and Full Stop Office. Now, some people I'm sure are already making comments mentioning how back when I reacted to Full Stop Heathcliff's kit, I said he was basically a 2-star ID, and now that everyone knows how absolutely earth-shatteringly powerful this ID can be, people act like I was incorrect with what I was saying. So let me clarify now. Full Stop Heathcliff, in my opinion, was pretty clearly meant to fill the role of a 2-star ID, in the sense that he supports Full Stop Honglu by following up on his attacks and providing him with extra coins when he is in backup or the Overwatch assignment state. Hopefully that logic makes more sense, because let me reassure you once again that the power level of Full Stop Heathcliff is nowhere near any of the 2-star IDs in the game. I mean, let's just look at these rolls. His clashing is ridiculous, but unlike Full Stop Honglu, Full Stop Heathcliff is very limited in his staying power, which is more in line with the philosophy of what a Full Stop ID should probably be anyways. He also gets his own special zoom in on his enhanced skill 3, and even if it does feel like it takes forever when you're just trying to get through a basic fight in MD, it is cool and does add a lot of emphasis on just how powerful Atelier bullets are supposed to be. I also appreciate how, whenever Target Spotted activates, there's a bit of dialogue where Hong Lu tells Heathcliff to shoot. Really, everything is basically perfect about this ID, especially how he brought single coin skills back into the limelight a little bit, showing how Dawn Office Sinclair wasn't just a one-off gimmick, and that a majority single coin skill kit can work, and work really, really well for a damage-dealing ID. Kurikumo Heathcliff is... Look, I don't get it. Why is he so... slutty? Sorry, I really don't know any other word to describe this, or worst of all of this. My theory is that Kurikumo Ishmael is giving him direct orders to serve the Kurikumo clan, and Heathcliff decided that serving, in the other sense, would just be a lot more fun. Just those few sentences kind of summarize my thoughts on Kurikumo Heathcliff perfectly, and while I would love to end the segment there for comedic effect, Kurikumo Heathcliff is actually pretty cool. First of all, that uptie story that flows with Ishmael's is fantastic, one of my favorites in the game, showing how Heathcliff really does work best when he's with others he can trust, and how he can't just take on the world himself, even if he is damn competent on his own. His kit is interesting in the sense that this is the first ID to gain defense power-up that makes actual good use out of it, since it's basically an attack power-up, but specifically for his counter skill. Rules of the Backstreets is about as iconic as Limbus skills get, and while the adaptation here isn't quite as stupidly good as Jun's, I still like the idea and execution of it. Especially since he can just hit with this unopposed after his allies take damage. You might notice I really like when lore and gameplay align, and Kurikumo Heathcliff is shockingly good in this regard. Ishmael is next, and while that does mean that each ID will probably get a little bit less individual focus, because, well, we are no longer talking about the best boy Heathcliff, it does also mean we get to talk about the only She ID in Limbus Company that feels like a She ID. That's still kind of a disappointment when it comes to She ID representation. While She Heathcliff has more relevant low HP conditionals technically, She Ishmael pretty much objectively has the best ratio of conditional to payoff, since getting below 50% HP is quite strict and requires at least a few turns. Therefore, to balance that out, we have Flashing Strike, which is still pretty much one of a kind due to adding coins to itself before clashing, and just that alone makes the 50% HP conditional both feel worth it and be worth it. To top it off, unlike Heathcliff, Ishmael actually has some sustain built into her kit with her skill 3, the exact opposite of Heathcliff, who can literally just die. And while having this balance between difficult conditional and good payoff makes She Ishmael by far my favorite of the She IDs, I can't love her, mostly because she's based off of the She from Ruina, despite being Section 5, and those are Section 2. Part of the fun of Limbus is seeing the different sides of certain associations showed in Ruina, at least to me. And since the She IDs have been lacking in terms of, IDs, I can't help but still feel pretty sour about the fact that this is all we have in terms of one of the more memorable factions from Ruina. Just the same tired gimmick of them being tired. She's the best ID out of the She trio, and she's also the only ID everyone in the game is literally forced to have. But for a free ID, she's solid and has some fun things you can play into to make her effective in the long-ish term, so I have to give her a lot of credit for that, even if, well, let's face it, Project Moon has really fumbled the ball in everything else. LCCB Ishmael is one of those IDs where I look at her kit and all I can really ask is, what is going on here? Paralyzed, Tremor, Rupture, and Fragile, all in actually good amounts, no less. Thing is, as neat as that is, this ID has always just been kinda bland to me. Yeah, she was one of the few launch IDs with the gun, and I really do mean few, and I know she definitely carried a lot of people who needed good blunt damage for Kanto 3, but I personally didn't use her for that, so she kinda is just Tremor Gunwoman in my mind. Also, both of her arts are just kinda bad, sorry to say it. At least she gets the honor of being the first truly mid ID in this video, so hey, at least she's notably average. There's a damn good reason Reindeer Ishmael was the face of Limbus for a while, at least from a meme perspective. Mind Whip is both a well-designed skill with a fun gambling gimmick, and also the easiest way for you to realize that most of the good IDs on launch were extremely weak to blunt, to the point that this skill was almost always a good way to more than stagger your teammates if you ignored its conditional. Her skill 1 has always been oddly powerful, which is a trait I often really enjoy in IDs. Also her passive, while incredibly simple, is actually pretty cool. Even something as simple as one attack power-up from 3 Gloom Resonance is more fun than 80% of passives in this game, since it just feels more impactful than if this was something like deal 10% more blunt damage when the moon is waning or some stupid shit. Reindeer Ishmael is simplicity done right. Easy as that. What? What do you want me to say, huh? That Sloshmill isn't F tier because I should have emotional attachment to her due to my railway videos? Sorry to burst your bubble, but as true as that may be, Sloshmill is easily the biggest example of having an absolutely dogshit and disappointing kit since she has none of the features of the enemies she's based on. Both of her up-tie arts are abominations in different ways, though admittedly Sinclair and Rodion laughing at Ishmael while Heathcliff is just disgusted is pretty funny, but being a bit funny and nostalgic in a meta sense doesn't make up for the fact that this ID's skill 3 reduces tremor count by 4 on burst in exchange for 5 rupture damage. The amount of arguments online I have had regarding the potential viability of her clash-lose effects on her skills are far too many. And the simple fact that optimal Sloshmo gameplay is arguably just spamming guard and using her against opponents with slash attacks is boring as hell. Fuck you, Sloshing Ishmael. The only actually good thing about you is that your skill 3 animation is cool, the rest of this ID just feels like it was hastily thrown together without even trying to do something interesting, which is unacceptable considering there was so much potential to do something with morale boost or tipsy and clash lose, anything. But no. This is what we got. I wanted to keep this section short. I promised myself and my therapist that I would. But despite the time that has gone by, my hatred for this ID has only grown. Easily my least favorite ID in the game if she wasn't at the center of some of my most fond videos, and even then, she still might just take the spot. Now that the train wreck is over, we can talk about cool Ishmael IDs again. For a while, anyway. Did you know I like the Leo Association? Because, the last video definitely made that very clear, and it's just gonna keep getting hammered home here. As the first really good Leo ID, Leo Ishmael really tickled my brain on release in a way basically no other ID could. And the fact her up-tie 4 basically introduced modern conditional mechanics on skill 2s, meaning up to +2 coin power on her skill 1, and skill 2 based on X amount of status, she's basically a benchmark ID for me in terms of the beginning of numbers getting bigger, but also just every ID being a whole lot more fun and powerful in various ways. Also, that little flourish she does at the end of her skill 3, I mean, she's just really cool and she knows it. One of my favorite IDs in the game still, which is impressive considering how simple she is. Muller Ishmael is an ID I just have one problem with, and that is the fact that she shouldn't exist. In the sense that Olga, as a character, really should have had Rodion get an ID for her. Now, we can choose to blame Outis or Ishmael for this, but I tend to blame Ishmael more here, even if that is unfair. Her ungodly amount of sinking count is powerful, even if it's not particularly fun beyond that. Her evade is silly for soloing, and her skill 3 is fun. Yeah, you can tell I'm not too passionate about an ID when I can't even muster a synonym for the word fun. She's just barely a B tier. Alright, I know, Captain Ishmael, big, important, bad end ID, extremely popular ID, everyone loves her, right? Well yeah, I do too. But also, I think she's incredibly overhyped, specifically from a lore perspective. In fact, I have genuine evidence about her being overhyped from a lore perspective, because I literally did a poll about this. While recency bias certainly was a factor, Captain Ishmael got number 1 in terms of being the best ID from a lore perspective back in July of last year. I think Captain Ishmael is really mediocre as a bad end ID. I don't think it's really her fault, especially since Canto 5 is already all about establishing how Ishmael and Ahab are so similar. but I think the lack of any kind of backstory or motivation being established in Captain Ishmael's Outis story is disappointing, especially compared to the other bad end IDs that we'll get to later in this video, and even the previous bad end IDs I've already talked about. Heathcliff got 2 different Outis stories pre and post Kanto, and Manager Dawn's Outis story is practically a sitcom episode with how long it is. Then Captain Ishmael just gets to mention a crimson whale and yell about compasses. As an actual ID, I really like the assist attack mechanic, since it has so many potential uses, but we all know that trying to actively use it on an ID with a particularly good skill 1 will never ever happen, even if you try your hardest. Looking at you, Diachi Honglu, god fucking damn it. I also do like her skill 3 animation, since there is no reason for her to be doing any of that in the middle of an active battlefield. Despite my non-gameplay related gripes, her gameplay and art are both really good. Yes, even her unique sanity mechanic, even if it makes her annoying in MD. This ID is still pretty comfortably in A tier, but if she had an Outis story that had the same impact as, say, a certain white German boy's Outis story, she could be a lot higher. Well, she couldn't be a lot higher because there's only 1 tier to go higher, but you get what I mean. Butler Ishmael is, this is gonna sound bad. People already really didn't like my opinions on Butler Ryoshu, and this ID was on the same banner. I think this banner might be one of my least favorite in the game's history. Maid Ishmael is just completely fine. Her only unique gimmick is increasing the amount of negative debuffs supplied by her skills if she crits on an enemy with lower speed than her. And even that is limited 3 times per turn, but whatever. Outside of that, she's just a speed ID with sinking. Now, normally I like speed IDs, and to be fair, I do not hate this ID's kit like I do with Butler Ryoshu. I just think it's pretty bland, unfortunately. My real problem comes with this ID visually and via the Outis story. First of all, I don't like maid outfits. Yeah, I know, I'm a freak, I'm a weirdo who doesn't understand what it's like to be cultured or whatever, but also, and this is extremely petty, however, I really hate the usage of blind obsession in her Outis story. Like, yes, Project Moon, I do understand that one of Ishmael's vices is being blindly obsessed with certain things. Can you spell it out just a little bit clearer for me? Oh yeah, thanks, actually, that works great. I know this is realistically a small thing, but as soon as I read this, I figuratively threw my hands in the air and walked out of the theater, promising to not really give a shit about this ID, and hey, luckily that's pretty easy when she's a basic-ass ID with no friends. Okay, I can't really prove that, I'm just upset. Zwei Ishmael is an ID that haunts me purely by circumstance. My most popular video, The Strongest IDs, was being released and worked on just around Zwei Ishmael's banner. And since I was very busy with that video, I barely got the opportunity to really see just how good she was before already being done editing the Ishmael section, so I just gave her an offhand mention, and a bunch of comments on that video were, rightfully, pointing out how good Zwei Ishmael is, and led to people thinking I was stupid and ignoring Zwei Ishmael, when it was really just a bad timing thing. Now, this doesn't really affect my opinion on the ID too much, but it does mean I feel the need to explicitly clarify how stupidly good this ID is, even in this video which is hardly focused on ID strength. It's funny as well, since the closest comparison I can make for Zwei Ishmael is to Wild Hunt Heathcliff, since most of her damage comes from using her defensive skill into her skill 3, which then deals a ton of extra damage from conditionals. Clashable Guards are a mechanic I found myself enjoying a lot more than I thought I would, especially in Railway 5, which is still the main place I've used Zwei Ishmael, and to top off all of the undeniable strength, her hair is both different from regular Ishmael and actually looks good, unlike the other Sinner whose hair also changed when she got an ID with armor. I do enjoy the defense level up gimmick, and while I do wish she had some kind of way to spread it around, it makes sense that she's a more selfish Zwei considering the difference between South and West Zwei. She's a great ID, and I enjoy her a lot, but she's still not my favorite Zwei ID, but she's a solid second place, not that competition is very hard. Kurokuma Ishmael is a team leader ID, one of 2 in the game that actually fully commit to the role. Blade Lineage Merceau is obviously the other one, and I'm glad Kurokuma Ishmael isn't an exact copy-paste of his mechanics, but for Kurokuma IDs instead of Blade Lineage. While they are both resonance-based, with KK Ishmael focusing on lust rather than pride, the Kurikumo as a whole have a focus on statuses, especially compared to the Blade lineage. So Ishmael's buff, Dark Cloud, giving extra bleed potency and unbreakable coins, rather than strictly coin and final power, is good in my opinion, even if it does mean older Kurikumo IDs weren't given the same new viability as old Blade lineage IDs. That's not to say the older KK IDs were completely left out to dry, since her skill 2 gives a whole 4 damage up to her whole team if you decide to use all of them, but the fact that she gives that big of a buff and they still aren't good should be an indicator of how generally mediocre most of them are, even if a Cloud Cutter that is 40% more powerful does sound good. Her skill 3 is satisfying and powerful, and like all Kurikumo IDs, I really enjoy her general aesthetic and animations. I think she could have very easily been somewhat predictable and boring, but she wasn't. And even if her unbreakable coins were annoying as fuck in Railway 5, I still enjoy her a lot. Roja is interesting to talk about for this video. It's ironic that she wants to be special so bad, and she certainly is in this case, just, not in a very good way. If ever there was a sinner that showcases how much better ID design has gotten since mid-season 2, well, let's just start at Kurikumo Roja, who, in fairness, does have some cool stuff like her counter being able to turn into her skill 3, and, her passive and support passive take different sin affinities, and that's it. I know a lot of people have a soft spot for this ID for some reason, but this is my video, and I certainly do not have a soft spot for her. In fact, I have the opposite. I've talked about this before, but her uptight 3 state where maintaining poise is literally impossible, making her entire counter equals skill 3 mechanic also impossible, shows a level of ID design incompetence that makes me assume the way poise works was changed right before release, or the person who made Kurikumo Roja really hated Roja. I respect her as a precursor to counter-focused IDs that I do enjoy now, but outside of that, bleh. She's lucky I like the little dark cloud flourishes that the KK IDs have, since otherwise she'd be way lower down than she is right now. Okay, if you're a Roja fan and you're already upset with me for giving KK Rodion a C tier, you maybe might want to potentially kind of skip the next 2 IDs. Alright, don't say I didn't warn you. I do not like LCCB Rodion. She's still basically the only ID in the game to utilize defense power down, probably because it sucks. Actually, no, not probably because it sucks. It is absolutely because it sucks. I like the weapon she uses, but not nearly enough to ignore the fact that her skill 3 removes its own conditional after the first hit. This thing went from always working to only ever working on the first hit against an outer... Like, how does that happen? Oh my god. Whatever. The only thing I really do like is the conditional based off of the next skill on the dashboard. I just wish that, you know, this cool mechanic was used on an actually cool ID. Since for some reason, this is entirely unique to LCCB Rodion, and while that would normally give her brownie points in my mind, it kinda just upsets me here. She's a gimmick ID with a niche that doesn't exist. Conditionals that are designed to fail, and other conditionals that are cool, but fail to redeem any of her worst aspects. And here is N-Corp Rodion, who exists. This is the last actually bad N-Corp ID I have to talk about, and thank God for it. She's just boring, and ugly, and has a Clash Win conditional on a skill that rolls a 10. Welcome back to the video, smart Roja fans. Rose Spanner Roja is the first good Rodion ID released into the game, and that's hardly a controversial take. I don't just mean in terms of her kit, since Rose Spanner Rodion's outfit is awesome, and her weapon is fitting considering, you know, Spanner. Even if her animations are just alright. This was the first ID to have reuse conditionals for her coins outside of launch IDs, and, you know, despite the skill 2 definitely not rolling very well, I do think that her Feast or Famine gambling for her reuse conditional, also known as just hitting heads, is decently fun, even if it can be frustrating to hit tails specifically and only on that second coin, and means you can't just get value when using this skill at low sanity. Her passive will also get some bonus points for me, by nature of not being capped for no reason, meaning if you have a bunch of skill slots for her, you can technically just spam her skill 3 and get a bajillion haste and a side of a limbillion blunt damage up the turn after. It's a slight shame that her skill 2 can't use that glorbillion blunt damage up, but I like when passives like this actually have potential to have a big impact on the way the ID functions. She's also part of the small group of IDs that have 4 sin affinities across their 4 skills, which is usually reserved for IDs that are special to some degree, and look, I do think that the Rose Spanners deserved at least one ID representative, but all I'm saying is Nico really ain't all that in terms of character complexity. If you don't remember who that is, then that proves my point. I'll fully ramble about the Rose Spanners when we get to the last of them near the end of the video, but this is the only truly good one in my eyes, and hey, at least she is genuinely enjoyable. And we're right back into dog shit, huh? Just when I was having fun. Rodion is an ID who has far too good of an Uptie 1 art, considering both her Uptie 3 art, which is super mid, and her absolutely, unbelievably terrible, frankly baffling, and all-around disgusting kit. Using poise count to gain shields is a fine concept. Critting to inflict fragile on her skill 3 is also a fine concept. What is not a fine concept is tying that crit on her skill 3 to a 5% chance because she has no poise potency, meaning that in your average battle, where you get a skill 3 every 6 skills, it would take you, on average, 120 skills to cycle enough to inflict 1 fragile next turn. Thank God this isn't same turn fragility, since her 2 to 4 speed range would make it relatively worthless. She was in my good graces after the Railway 2 Worst Team series, but that was, you know, well over a year ago, so instead I'm left with nothing but her kit, animations, and art, and all of that unfortunately combines into a bad ID. Scratch that, a really bad ID. Okay, we're out of the Rodion trenches, and we can finally have nothing but decent to excellent IDs from here on out, and Diechi Rodion falls into the excellent category very solidly. Our proper introduction to discard was an extremely unexpected one. I remember the speculation for this ID in particular very fondly, since I was also very wrong about what I thought her kit would look like, and fortunately, I was completely incorrect in a good way. Looking at Roja with modern standards, she's really not all that complicated. But back then, this was a lot of text for one ID. Especially considering Insight as a mechanic was new, Discard was new, and frankly, Sinking was only beginning to be a real archetype by this point, since Rhyme Shank would soon become the lifeblood for Sinking in usage alongside this ID. In short, I just think Diechi Rodion is really fun and simple if you don't want to think about it too much, but if you want to interact with the Insight mechanic, you can play her a completely different way, and that's part of why I really like the only 2 Diechi IDs in the game. While it certainly is more important for Hong Lu, saving 3 Insight via placing a defensive skill and not using it leads to Diechi Roja not rolling below a 15 on any of her skills, which is still pretty alright even today. I remember the genuine excitement I felt when people would tell me they didn't know about the Insight trick, and them telling me that it made Diechi Rodion a lot more fun for them was seriously heartwarming back in the day. Liu Rodion is a Liu ID. Yeah, I know, but come on, she was a burn ID when burn needed it most, and outside of the maximum 30 wrath damage on her skill 3, which I really fucking hate, I like everything else about her a lot. Her Uptie 1 art and acquisition animation are both adorable, and I like her Uptie 3 art a decent amount. Admittedly, she's a pretty tame attempt at a team leader ID, especially compared to Biel Merceau, who came right before her, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And either way, I'm just very biased toward the Liu and their sound effects / animations, but I'll graciously save you from any more ramblings regarding that. What I will not refrain from rambling about is, again, how much I dislike this cap on her wrath damage. I'd be fine if it was a bit higher, but 30 just feels a bit low considering how much burn already struggled with quick burst damage. I think I'm just very sensitive to burn IDs in particular, having an annoyingly low cap on things. I don't care that much about it. Again, she's a Liu ID and therefore cannot do anything wrong. If she wasn't a Liu ID though, well, let's just say that capitalism wouldn't be Roja's biggest problem anymore. Speaking of capitalism, T-Corp Rodion is weird. She's one of those clash power instead of coin power warriors, and while I'm not a huge fan of that in general, I have to appreciate this ID for being a 2-star that can still utilize the main gimmicks of the T-Corp IDs, those being Time Moratorium and Borrowed Time. Her skill 3 animation when she is in the Borrowed Time state is far too good considering the relative lack of complexity in her kit. I'm not saying that is really a bad thing, it's just surprising. She's meant as a niche sloth burst damager who otherwise supports Tremor pretty well, at the downside of heavily lacking in Tremor bursts. So while she doesn't stand out, I also do appreciate her for managing to fight hand to hand while keeping that stupid top hat balanced on her head the whole time, somehow. I do not know how to feel about Devyat Rodion. Okay, well that's a lie. I would still be writing this script if that was the case, but seriously, I don't know how to feel about her. On one hand, she's essential to form the Gluttony Resonance Rupture nuke team that I enjoy a lot. And even outside of it, she's just a good damage dealer with a limited time on the field. On the other hand, the limited time on the field really dissuades me from even thinking about using her, since strong damage dealers are about a dime a dozen, and I generally like to plan for the worst, which is to say, I assume fights may take way longer than they actually will. I can't deny the innovation that strategic R&R mode brought to Limbus, considering that Full Stop Heathcliff basically did this mechanic, but a bit better and less weird to pull off. I know it's just using a counter, but automatically leaving the encounter just feels better, even if you have less control over it. Maybe that makes no sense, but sometimes it really is just based on vibes, and the vibes are mediocre here. For the first ID of a new faction, I think she had sufficient new additions and innovations, as I like to call them, and I enjoy the concept of a delivery service in the city, and the way that the Devyat IDs can just explode is pretty entertaining. But despite all those things I like about her, I think she's still just a B tier in my mind. Maybe that's too mean, but the main thing I like about her is one very specific team, and admittedly, I don't use her anywhere else, so unlucky. Princess of La Mancha Rodion has replaced Dietchi as my go-to Roja to just kinda throw into whatever team I want. Princess Roja was a surprising ID for me, because I really didn't expect to like her nearly as much as I do now. A big part of Princess Roja's appeal is, surprisingly, her animations. I don't just mean her empowered skill 3, as good as that one does look, but even just her skill 2. There's something really nice about the tornado effect and the sound effects together that make it satisfying to use, and it helps that this skill has one of my favorite, yet most simple effects, and that is giving her allies attack power up. Specifically, this skill will always give 2 attack power up to Manager Dawn, since Manager Dawn has the lowest max HP of any ID you should realistically be using, and she's a Blood Fiend. Adding just a simple 2 extra attack power to certain skills makes them feel a whole lot better, and even the 1 attack power up on whatever other ally this skill happens to benefit also just feels nice. Of course, it helps that Princess Roja does something that most of my favorite IDs do, which is either having a skill 1 that feels good to use, or something easily accessible to consistently replace skill 1s. In this case, her counter is central to ramping up her Blooming Thorn, it clashes better than her skill 1 unconditionally, and is an excellent way to remove bleed from allies and keep bleed going on the enemy. The fact she has Rupture is, bizarre, and makes her have way more on-hit effects than she probably needed to have, but this does continue the very well-established trend in Project Moon lore, which is that umbrellas equals Rupture. Just trust me on that one, please. While I'm not huge on this ID's art or lore, both are obviously still good, and if you leave her on your title screen window alone for a while, she'll sing the La Mancha Parade theme, which is a cute nod to basically the entirety of Canto 7 Part 2. Originally, she was just going to be an A-tier ID, but I really do like Princess Rodion enough to give her the coveted S-tier. Now, you might be thinking that there's a Rodion ID I have missed, but at the time of making this video, C Rodion has been out for less than a week, and I have not gotten my grubby hands on her. Maybe in like 3 years I'll do a follow-up to this video going over every ID again, but I'll be cripplingly old at that point at the ripe age of 24, so that will likely never happen on account of me being in the retirement home. Sorry. I don't have a smooth transition into the Sinclair section of this video. Blade Lineage Sinclair is really just a disgrace. When Limbus launched, this was the closest thing we had to a bamboo-hatted Kim ID, cause for some unknowable reason, Blade Lineage Sinclair has a skill called To Claim Their Bones. Now this isn't really a problem on its own, the problem is twofold. Number 1, this skill sucked ass on release. Partially because single coin skills were unable to be very good until like a year and some odd months after release, and 2, and more importantly, this is To Claim Their Bones without any yielding of the flesh. Yes, there's his counter in this clash-lose effect, but nothing like what we would later end up getting with Biel Merceau. Now, is it unfair to judge him in retrospect? Fuck no, that's the whole point of this video. The only cool thing he has kit-wise is his passive's effect, where he gains poise count when other people gain poise count, half the time anyway, and even that is far less interesting compared to what Biel Yisang got. And no, I don't think slapping a 150% crit damage to Claim Their Bones counts as cool, since that's just how it should have been to begin with. I hate the fact that this ID actually has pretty cool Uptype 3 art, because otherwise, well, you know where it would be going. No. Fuck off. Mariachi Sinclair is bad. He's stupid in concept, execution, kit design, and animations, but I really cannot hate him in the same way I hate on other stupid IDs because, well, he's just the right amount of silly to me. Is he missing out on aggro for no reason? Yeah, of course. Are 5/6 of his rolls on his skills, even with conditionals active, reminiscent of a Minecraft YouTuber's dating range? Absolutely. There's just something about this white boy going ham, hitting people with maracas, and being so fucking dramatic about it too, it just really scratches the right part of the brain. His Uptype 3 art is the only thing I can say is genuinely cool about him. Everything else is terrible, but lucky for him, it's in the best possible way. N-Corp Sinclair is an N-Corp ID, and I am not very kind to the N-Corp faction here. But N-Clair is very lucky that he's probably still the best executed bad end ID in a lot of ways. With almost all the other bad end IDs, they are clearly based on an individual we see in their related conto. The fact that N-Clair was such a big will they, won't they back in Season 1 meant that his ID teaser alone showed Limbus players how things were gonna work from now on. His Uptype story is one of the first I could actively remember reading fully, since around the time from launch to Season 1, Uptype stories were far shorter than what you might be used to now. And N-Clair's actually gave good and interesting context on what happened to Sinclair to make him get so, well, whatever you call this. And that's part of the reason why I was so harsh on Captain Ishmael's Uptype story. Now I can and will praise N-Clair for being one of, if not the single most influential ID in the entirety of Limbus Company's history. Because the idea of when's the next negative SP ID since Sunshower Heathcliff has been super prevalent. Every bad end ID is speculated to be a negative SP ID because of N-Clair. Unfortunately, I think the fact that he was so prominent for so long means he suffers from oversaturation in a similar way to another ID, and while it's not as bad as that other guy, it still reduces my opinion of him a bit. Still, for probably being the best executed bad end ID who completely changed the way people theorize about new IDs, he's gonna get an A tier. If only he wasn't literally everywhere for so long, he would probably get an S tier, but alas, poor Emil. Look, I've already dedicated 10 minutes of a 20-minute video to Talisman Sinclair, specifically his support passive, and while I don't want to dismiss any ID solely on the reasoning that I have already made a video on them, I've already said basically all I could want to say about Talisman Sinclair in that video. But I will say, the fact that Talisman is such an infamous/famous ID with his own gimmick that actually makes him interesting to use, even if it's frustrating, and he's just a 2-star released in Season 2, makes the fact that Sloshmo got treated the way she did even worse. Molar Sinclair is meh. I like some aspects of his kit, since he was the first and currently only ID with a 4-coin skill 1, and his tremor count transferring mechanic via his skill 3 is genuinely cool, and other tremor IDs have taken this concept and ran with it using him as a basis. At the same time, if I had a gun to my head and was told to name every ID in Limbus Company, I think that Molar Boatworks Sinclair would be one of the last ones I name, if not the one that gets me killed because I forgot about him. Objectively, he's not that boring, but god if he's not just kinda there. I'd like Project Moon to give another try at the 4-coin skill 1 concept in the modern day, and part of the reason why I'll miss 2 stars in Limbus is because they were allowed to experiment and do wacky things, like have a 4-coin skill 1 that rolls a 6 unconditionally, and even if it didn't really work out here, at least he was still an attempt at something new. Going into this segment of the video, I thought Sinclair would be an easy A or S tier ID, because well, I like my Sank IDs. I like haste-focused IDs with good numbers. But for some reason, I realized while writing this script, I really don't care for anything about this ID besides the fact that he's easy and decently satisfying to use. On paper, single combat certainly is a unique thing that he has. But the idea of focusing one skill slot, even with a Sank ID, would later be better executed with Sank West Merceau. It's not like I hate him. Not by any stretch, really. But I also don't like him nearly as much as I thought I would, since his art is just pretty good and his lore is fine as well. Though really, I do hold Sinclair up to a pretty high standard in terms of his uptie stories and lore for specific reasons. It's close, but I still think he is an A-tier ID. He's still speed-based and part of the Sank, so I do enjoy him quite a lot, and I did make a video about him, so that helps too, but he lacks that certain something to make him really stand out, besides to just be a strong, reliable clasher that goes fast. So, in case it wasn't obvious enough, Dawn Office Sinclair, and Enclair to a lesser extent, is the reason why I hold Sinclair IDs to very high uptie story standards, because I think Dawn Office Sinclair's is simply the best in the game. Now, a lot of that is because I played Ruina and I like Philip as a character, and I do think people who do not know the lore of LobCorp or Ruina won't be able to like this uptie story nearly as much, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Part of what I like about this uptie story is that it shows Sinclair isn't just a coward like a lot of people like to generalize or joke about. Yes, he's uncertain of himself and terrified in the face of so much death that he feels is his fault, but in spite of that, he doesn't let it overtake him. Instead, he accepts his flaws, realizing that no one should be responsible for his own pain and sadness, and he stands and fights instead of running away and pushing his problems onto more people who will just continue to die. It's hard to explain without getting into the entirety of Ruina and the entirety of LobCorp, but getting more insight into both Philip and Sinclair via this one uptie story really made it special to me, even outside of the "you're wrong, Miss Carmen" line. All of that is not even mentioning that this ID was the first one to receive direct buffs from Kim Ji-hoon himself, and not mentioning that he was the first instance of an ID with 2 different forms and kinda 6 different skills. Blazing Strike has already gotten a lot of praise by proxy in this video for being the first single coin non-ego skill since Mutilate to genuinely feel good to use, while also just having a cool animation. Everything about this ID makes him fascinating as a point of history for Limbus, to the point where having the best uptie story in the game is just one of many things that makes me like him so much. The world only has room for one Zwei Sinclair, and this is the only one of the two that doesn't make my blood boil when I think of him. Of course, I can't act like Zwei West Sinclair is a perfect ID. I think his art is just fine, and while I understand why he was a 2-star alongside Sank West Merceau, he really is Zwei Ishmael but way worse, which would have been much more acceptable if he was a 2-star on her banner. The fact that this is also Sinclair's 3rd 2-star with a focus on Tremor is impressive, I think, especially considering he's only got 5 of those total. While I like the way that Zwei Ishmael is meant to function, using defensive stance to intercept and deal massive damage, or use her Clashbow Guard whenever she may need to, the fact that Zwei Sinclair doesn't have defensive stance means that his gameplay loop is a lot more basic. He's mediocre in every sense of the word, but hey, at least he's not that guy. 15x3 Rupture is a fun archetype in my opinion, but there's a big asterisk attached to that enjoyment. The downside of being an ID that uses 15x3 Rupture is that you stop inflicting rupture and rupture count when the target is above 15 by 3. There's no problem with that, so long as the payoff for no longer inflicting rupture is actually good. Deviat Sinclair's payoff is not good. 2 defense level down per coin is not the worst thing on paper. However, when we consider that his rupture count application is actually really good when he has enough courier trunk, and in exchange for losing that, you are instead going heavily rupture count negative and applying a debuff that, let's be honest, most times feels like it is doing next to nothing, even if it does technically increase your damage. Now, a lot of people will use these shitty rupture conditionals as an excuse to call Deviat Sinclair as an ID bad, which is just strictly untrue. Just like Deviat Roja can be, Deviat Sinclair can just be a generic damage dealer in rupture ID clothing. He certainly is much better when there's at least 15 rupture on the opponent, and again, he does have good count when there's less than 3 count. But that's a very thin margin of error to work with when you have 3 coin skills that can delete all of your count instantly. So, in a weird way, despite being so similar to Deviat Rodion on first glance, he actually has completely different use cases due to having a different damage type and lacking the ability to not consume rupture count on hit. Now let me get something straight, that does not excuse the fact that Sinclair of all sinners got this ID, since any other sinner getting this ID would have been met with far less backlash, considering Talisman Sinclair's mere existence. So, on one hand, I think this particular version of the White Boy is overhated. But also I can fully understand and partially support wanting to burn him at the stake for his crimes. I really like Middle Sinclair. Basically, the only thing I wish he had that he doesn't right now is a little bit of bleed count to justify his bleed conditionals, and yes, that even includes his battle sprite. I will stand by my opinion of Dawn and Merceau looking terrible, but just the small addition of this coat and even the purple shoes just makes it work so much better. It also helps that his chains aren't just there to punch people with, since they hold up his little book of vengeance. And since my biggest problem with the middle IDs is fixed with this Sinclair, it shouldn't be a surprise that I really like his kit. I already thought Middle Dawn was good, and Middle Sinclair basically just expands on her same concepts, like how his counter isn't Feast or Famine, in the sense that he can still get a pretty big benefit from only having 4 Envy Absolute Resonance and replacing his counter with his skill 2, and he has an additional resource to manage with his Book of Vengeance buff, which can lead to a whole bunch of extra damage to mostly make up for his mediocre coin power conditionals. He also has aggro to help him with his counter-focused gameplay, which is crazy to think that Middle Dawn doesn't have that, and direct synergy with other middle IDs. Middle Sinclair really is everything good about the middle IDs made modern, for lack of a better word. I wrote all of this in my script before I used Middle Sinclair for the first part of Can't Wait, and I gotta say, I think he's the only ID close to knocking out Harpooner Heathcliff from the top spot. Never thought I would see the day, but Middle Sinclair is just super fucking cool. Outis, alongside Faust, had the high honor of only having 2-star IDs when Limbus launched in February of 2023, which makes the fact that Blade Lineage Outis exists that much more unfortunate. Outis only had 2 options for IDs, BL Outis and G-Corp, and of course her base ID, which was pretty much objectively the best choice at the time. I'm very lucky that when I started playing, I got G-Corp Outis pretty much immediately, because if I got Blade Lineage Outis and tried to use her, I think my brain would have lost what little function it has left. It's a familiar song and dance at this point, but let's do a simple counting exercise. At Uptie 3, BL Outis gains 1 poise count on Clash Win with her skill 2. On turn end, poise count is reduced by 1. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that 1 minus 1 is 0, but clearly there wasn't a lot of thought put into actually reaching this dogshit on crit conditional for her skill 3 anyways. Yippee Ray. And no, I don't care that her support passive is good, and no, I don't care that she's not the worst thing ever on a BL team, she's just so boring. Railway worst team trauma aside, the only appeal is that her Uptie 1 art is kinda neat, and her skill 3 animation is alright. Otherwise, fuck off. You know those mobile game ads? Choose a way to born, kind baby or evil baby. while Evil Baby is who we just talked about, and G-Corp Outis is the beautiful, kind baby, who is still a baby in terms of power level and actually good use cases, but at least she's kind. I'm being a bit harsh for the sake of the baby analogy, but I really do like the concept of G-Corp Outis. Not really the bug soldier thing, I don't care about that at all, but a purely supportive ID is something I wish we would see more of. Part of why I like Princess Rodion or Captain Ishmael is their supportive aspects. Her effects are simple. Skill 1 is 2 protection to the lowest speed ally, Skill 2 is 2 damage up to the lowest speed ally, as well as a free 1 attack power up on use, and her passive continually applies haste to adjacent allies with 2 sloth resonance. Again, it's very simple, and she's still one of 2 IDs in the game to be entirely single coin. And while her damage suffers greatly for it, I really don't mind because this is a launch ID with an actually good execution of its concept, which, as we've seen, is incredibly rare somehow. She's a low A tier, which is higher than what I expected to give her, but hey, I have to respect the fact that her kit still feels fresh, and her way of attacking hasn't been replicated to this day, so her animations still stand out. 7 Outis is such an unfortunate product of her time. I think that's the best way to describe her, since when she released, she was super cool to me, but looking at her now, she's just kinda odd. Don't believe me? Maybe it's easier to see if I say it all out loud. 7 Association South Section 6 Director Outis is a debuffing ID with Paralyze, offense level, and defense level down, combined with a bit of Rupture on the side. But she's also an ID designed to clash well, but has a skill 3 that only rolls a 12 unconditionally, which is kind of 14. And she's the only ID to ever use this specific wording where instead of gaining clash power, she explicitly lowers the opponent's clash power. That's not all though, since she's also kind of meant to do good damage with weakness analyzed and her passive, which increases her damage, but her extra damage numbers are also just so mediocre that she kind of ends up just doing everything okay-ish. Hopefully that makes it make a bit more sense. I really don't like things like this skill 3 effect. It reminds me of N-Corp Heathcliff's pretty pathetic 10% extra damage, but at least that's each hit of his skill 3. This is 15% one time. It's a shame too, because once again, this is the only time we have had something like this. Bonus damage of a different damage type to the actual skill. On top of that, she's the only non-launch ID to have a speed range of 5 to 8. So, what do I think of her? I don't know. She's a confused mess, and while I just praised G-Corp Outis having underutilized mechanics in her kit, 7 Outis unfortunately just feels weird looking back on her rather than fresh. Outis didn't get another ID for 5 months following 7 Outis, but the wait was well worth it in my opinion, since Molar Outis is just damn fun, and she showed how good discard can be when paired with an ID that is meant to clash well and deal a ton of damage. Most S-tier IDs require some kind of long explanation, but really I've just been a Molar Outis fan since day one, and I still am even now. Sank Outis, just like Sank Sinclair on the same banner, is a landmark ID in a few ways. Firstly, in the most obvious and surface level sense, Sank Outis is the first actually good evade tank ID, and beyond that, Sank Outis is just a good ID. Her damage isn't crazy or anything, but it certainly isn't bad, and she was an earlier attempt than Dawn Claire to make a single coin skill deal actually good damage, and for what it is, it actually does do solid damage when you crit. She's easily one of the best 2-star IDs for clashing, and I only say clashing with air quotes that you can't see, because while her numbers with her easy conditionals are good for clashing, the real winner is the 18 rolling evade, but her skill 2 and skill 3 are not bad at all either. I don't have any particularly good or bad memories associated with this ID, nor have I used her all that much in the grand scheme of things. I just think she's pretty neat, and another good example of 2-star IDs that are allowed to be more experimental versions of the 3 stars on the same banner. Is Sank Sinclair better? No doubt about it. But do I like Sank Outis far more from a conceptual standpoint alone? Absolutely. Oh boy. Okay. Don't shoot the messenger here, but Magic Bullet Outis is not very well designed. I feel like this should be an easy-to-accept perspective, but I know people will get on my case about it regardless, so just hear me out for a moment. When I say Magic Bullet Outis is not well designed, what I really mean is that she wasn't successful enough at what she was clearly meant to do, which is give Burn a way to catch up to the other statuses in terms of potential. Dark Flame is a very powerful debuff. Up to 99 pride damage per stack, with a max stack of 7, means that after using a skill 3, you could easily deal 693 pride damage. Though that easily comes with some heavy stipulations. Like the fact that getting maximum value out of this requires you to kind of spam your guard skill or wait a lot of turns to build up Magic Bullet stacks, since your skill 2 stops giving you Magic Bullet and inflicting Dark Flame once you're at 4 Magic Bullet. Now, you can claim all you want that this design was intentional, and that's fine. You can say that. But considering Project Moon released an ego specifically designed to make this process faster, now leading to Burn being even more reliant on specific Walpurgisnacht IDs and ego, that kinda sucks, no? Okay, yeah, I'm not discussing ego in this video, but it's hard not to when, you know, that's her. That's Jane Magic Bullet. All this criticism to say that literally almost everything else about this ID is perfect. Uptie's story is fantastic, animations are great, and so is the art, and the fact that she has one of the best skill 1s in the game for clashing with conditionals active is also fun. But if I could give just one more complaint, I do wish the actual gun was used more than 1 in every 6 skills. Unfortunately, I don't think she's quite an S-tier ID to me anymore, since I really don't like when an ID is significantly worse without their one specific ego that makes them feel way better to use, and this is the biggest example by far. Butler Outis is a sneakily cool ID. Of course, she does have the obvious echoes of the Manor, which is a great debuff and the first instance of changing enemy panic types, which, while it's not the main appeal, is neat, especially since, if nothing else, you get the lowered chance to roll heads on enemies without SP. The sinking synergy of Echoes of the Manor is something I sometimes go back and forth on liking, since in theory it could be incredible, but in theory it can also do nothing. And in general, I think Echoes brings a new way to look at syncing, since individual applications of syncing, like Reindeer Ishmael's Mind Whip, end up looking not nearly as bad, and some emphasis is taken away from single big instances of syncing and syncing count. Now, that is a neat shakeup to the formula, but it's not what makes Butler Outis sneakily cool, since that's pretty surface level. What I really like is Butler Outis's passive, which makes her gain extra sanity if she wins a clash flawlessly, which I think fits her lore as an uptight butler very well, and her extra sanity effects are neat too. All of that combined with her sinking count payoff means she flows nicely, a lot better than most other IDs, even if at a glance her effects are pretty simple outside of Echoes. I don't want to talk about any ID with the word ring in it in this video. She's fun, I guess. Cloud Cutter but better, really good bleed count. You've heard it all before. She goes in C tier just by association. Cry about it, I guess. W Corp Outis was the birth of Charge Potency, but really, I don't care too much about that. What really matters to me is just how cool this ID looks. I've talked about how I like when IDs change the hairstyle of the Sinners many times, and I think W Outis's ponytail is really top tier, and both her Uptie 1 and Uptie 3 art help show off just how bulky her gauntlets are, which make her animations carry much more weight. I like all of the W Corp IDs and how they look, but Outis is probably my favorite just in terms of her sprite. Okay, and I guess I will talk a little bit about her actual kit and charge potency, and it's there, for sure. I like the way her charge barrier ramps up, but load as a buff is really just, it's a thing, I guess. I'd argue this is one of the most forgotten buffs in all of Limbus, because while it can get to a decent 30% boost in longer fights, it's also being used on W Corp IDs, which already deal a bunch of extra damage with damage conditionals. Her initial ramp up is a little slow, and by a little slow I mean it feels like hell compared to basically every other W Corp ID, but she's also an actual ramp up ID, unlike the other ones, which are just resource spenders with no permanent benefits being gained. W Outis is definitely hard carried by her art and animations, and while I kind of hate to just keep handing out A tiers or higher to 3-star Outis IDs, that streak is just gonna keep going, I guess. Okay, never mind, the fun's over. Look, I really don't care to get myself involved in discourse regarding Butler Outis's strength. That's not my problem with her. My problem with her is that, on release, she was bugged to be able to get +2 coin power on her skill 3, and now she doesn't have that. That makes me sad. Okay, that's not the only problem, but it is frustrating when an ID gets nerfed because they were bugged to be better than they were supposed to be. Really, I just find that Barbara Outis is uninteresting. She's not as bad of a case as, say, Butler Yoshu or Sloshmill, because she's actually pretty faithful to the enemy she's based on. But everything outside her skill 3 is really... bleh. And speaking of that skill 3, why is this first damage bonus capped at specifically 57%? Is it some kind of reference to something that I don't know? A vague hint that Merceau and Heathcliff Center 5 and Center 7 are secretly blood fiends? Whatever it is, it's just odd. I do have to give it to Barbara Outis. Her art and animations are really good. The sounds the scissors make are perfect. She's just an unfortunate victim of comparison. And being the first of the Blood Fiend group didn't really help. So Blood Feast didn't really do much for her, and there wasn't a good way to get it anyways. It's definitely not a fair situation to be in. Once again, none of this list is fair, so at least she gets a B for Barber. And that's entirely because of how much work PM put into all of the Blood Fiend Trio sprites, because god, all of these are really good. While Heisho Outis is next on the list to talk about, I'll actually be talking about Heisho Ryoshu alongside her, since she barely missed out on being a part of the first part of the video, and also because they are both incredibly similar. With the main difference being that Ryoshu is focused around Clash wins, whereas Outis gains her main benefits from going unopposed. Since Clash win IDs has been done plenty of times, it shouldn't be a surprise that I prefer Outis's kit even if it is a little less practical. And this on unopposed attack conditional would work really well for a, certain unnamed association. Anyways, I like both of their gameplay loops, basically revolving around making sure that their buff Strider Mao is up at all times to keep them above 10 speed, well, assuming you don't hit the dreaded 9 speed, which is the only thing that keeps these IDs from being uber consistent death machines, since there is a 25% chance you roll a natural speed of 4, meaning even with 5 haste you're not above 10 speed, and honestly, this shit somehow feels worse than hitting 5% chance tails at 45 SP. A big part of what makes this gameplay loop feel good is that their counters are clashable. And I'm really glad that these are single coin and rupture count neutral, because it doesn't make them feel insanely powerful. Having this counter as a downtime is still fair, but it's far better than using a non-damaging guard or evade or something else like that. Visually, these IDs are alright. I like Ryoshi's up Taiwan art, their sprites are fine, which I feel like might be controversial, but look, competition is real tough, not everyone can be a slam dunk winner. Overall, I like Outis just a slight bit more, but they're so similar, I'm just gonna put them both in the high end of B tier. What's the difference between high B tier and regular B tier? Good question. Finally, we're at the last sinner for this duo of videos, Gregor. If you've made it this far and you've watched through every sinner's section up till now, thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this video so far. Gregor is yet another weird case, since although he was my favorite sinner for a long time, I have a love-hate relationship with Gregor's IDs, since they tend to be odd ones out, outcasts if you will, and while that can sometimes lead to really cool IDs with new mechanics, other times, these new mechanics are very underutilized or underpowered. But none of that applies to Liu Gregor, who is the most basic-ass ID ever. Seriously, his effects are burn and attack power up. Those are the keywords he has. No burn spreading, no burn count, just burn. That said, he's a Liu ID and I do tend to like those, but I can really only give him a B tier since while I like his up Tie 3 art, everything else about this ID is very standard. But I will say his guard sprite is interesting since it implies his arm can shapeshift, or just he has a shield inside of it for defensive purposes. Whatever it is, I'd like to see more of that out of this ID, but instead he ends up just being fine. Okay, I know I already said at the beginning that I have a weird relationship with Gregor IDs, and now I'm saying weird again, but G-Corp Gregor is weird. Part of that is the natural plight of being a launch 3-star ID, but if someone who started playing Limbus after launched looked at this ID just from a numbers perspective, I mean, he's literally a shitty 2-star. Which is such a shame, because I love the lifesteal mechanic. I didn't bring it up on previous Blood Fiends because I think the way it's done here is more satisfying. With the Blood Fiends, you see constant small numbers of healing, but with G-Corp Gregor, it's bigger numbers since it's based on higher percentages of damage dealt, and something about that is a lot better in my opinion. Now, I also have a huge bias towards G. Gregor, because he was the first 3-star I remember pulling and using, and he's definitely up there in terms of IDs I wish could get some kind of tune-up, since I think this ID deserves way better than what he got. They nerfed this guy's skill 3. The skill 3 that rolls a 9 got nerfed. Chef Gregor just saddens me, because some parts of this ID are great, like the voice acting and the Uptie 3 art, and some things are irredeemable, like the Uptie 1 art and his kit. Chef Ryoshu got a pretty cool kit considering she was released so soon after launch, and Gregor, by comparison, got a 2-star who feels like a negative 1-star. About the skill 3 nerf, I know it technically wasn't a nerf, it was a bug fix because the skill 3 was always meant to be based on bleed count, but that just begs the question of why the fuck was that the conditional they decided on? To this day, needing 10 of a status like bleed or sinking is only necessary when you're getting into double conditionals, and that's potency, not count, which is a huge difference. In order to reach average skill 3 numbers on Chef Gregor, you would need the entirety of Harpooner Heathcliff's skill 2 bleed count conditional. I think you get my point. He does not go into the F tier because of the few good things he has being good enough to save him. His problems are just a tragic result of Project Moon not understanding how statuses work. Alright, bear with me here. Why the fuck are there 3 Rose Spanner IDs in this game? It's hardly even spoilers to say that the Rose Spanners are an irrelevant background presence in Canto 4, with I'm pretty sure less than 10 lines and even less actual combat with them. The fact that we have 1 entire K-Corp ID and 3 Rose Spanners, despite one faction being present for 1.5 Cantos and an Intervalo, is absurd to me. I don't really care that Rose Spanner Gregor has the funny Chainsaw Man arm. He makes me angry because his inclusion feels like it could have gone to a different, much more interesting 2-star. It sucks that his Uptie 1 art is so good, and well, that's actually where the upsides end. Well, that makes this easy then. Spy Gregor is just the coolest. For a long while, this was my favorite ID, and he's the reason why I'm such a big fan of the defense level up mechanic, even though it is, objectively speaking, very simple. Having a 4-coin skill 2 is really satisfying to me. I like when an ID's arguably most powerful skill is their skill 2, since that means you get 2 chances to use your most powerful skill per skill cycle, and it's not like his skill 3 is bad, the setup is just a little bit more complicated to reach some of the higher conditionals, but I don't mind that here. I love his skill 3 animation. Taking a smoke break mid-battle is hilarious, and these Zweihanders are just a cool weapon to watch. I really wish Zweigregor came out today, since I feel like he would have had a similar mechanic to what Heisho Faust of all IDs has ended up getting, where he steps in and takes the hit, but his release is just around that mid-season 2 point where IDs started getting really good, and he's a big reason I use that time around August 2023 as a point of reference, because how can you not love a guy with an Uptie 1 art that looks like this? Pirate Gregor is badass. It's a shame that he's the only pirate ID we ended up getting, especially considering that the Rose Spanners got 3 representatives despite having a fraction of the relevancy the Twin Hooks have, but hey, whatever. At least what we did get was really good. Poise IDs were non-existent before Season 3, and Pirate Gregor was a really good reintroduction for it into the Limbus ecosystem. He was the first instance of plus critical damage on crit outside of the buffs given to old IDs via Uptie 4, and boy howdy does that skill 3 still hit pretty hard, and goddamn is the animation and sound effect satisfying. Though that really applies to all of his skills, something about that hook hit sound effect is just cocaine, especially when there's a lovely crit sound accompanying it. I'd like to reiterate what a shame it is we never got a Captain Hook ID, since Gregor mentions them a few times in his dialogue, and having a trio of pirates being buffed by a team leader ID would be awesome. Also, to whoever made both of these Uptie arts, wow, you really like Gregor. Kurokumo Gregor makes me sad, because he looks so cool, and for what? 1+ coin drop when the opponent has 7+ bleed? Some mediocre offense level down? I'm sorry, the fact that Gregor is meant to be a Kurokumo captain, and yet he's a 2-star who is this underwhelming is a shame. Especially since, again, he's got really cool animations. I like when he hits people with a bottle. It's cool, but there's really not much to say about him, because he's just a mediocre debuffer, and hey, wait a fucking second, he stole Chef Gregor's 10+ bleed conditional on his skill 3. Gregor's 2 stars are just a mess, unfortunately. I'm giving him a B tier, but just know that's entirely because of his looks and animations, and because his kit doesn't have anything too wrong with it, it's just mid. Edgar Family Heir Gregor. The ID was such a good Uptie 1 and Uptie 3 art, a lovely miserable look in his eyes, and the prime example of a Gregor ID having a severely underutilized mechanic. First of all, let me just say that I don't like his skill 3. Partially because it only has clash power conditionals, but also because of this last effect here, where it absorbs up to 10 of your precious sinking potency half the time to give him 3 damage up and a plus coin boost. The idea of siphoning away some of your main status to buff yourself is cool, but 10 is just way too much ramp down, considering you're only buffing a 1 or 2 coin skill the turn after. Unless you're using Solemn Lament, in which case, yes, it's very worth it. That entire ego makes me view this ID a bit more favorably, but this isn't an ego video, and also, I still don't want to remove 10 sinking even half the time, when it's not unreasonable to assume you can turn that 10 sinking into far more damage over time than what you get out of Edgar Gregor's bonuses. But my main problem is with his passive, because this gaining damage based on sanity difference from last turn is so interesting. And how does he interact with it? He doesn't, really, at all. Sure, you could get hit and activate that sinking you've absorbed, but you still need 3 Gloom Resonance. Yeah, you can use Ego, but that doesn't feel very good, at least to me. You're telling me he couldn't have gotten a unique sanity mechanic to play into this? Bullshit. So overall, I do like Edgar Gregor, but I know I do not like him nearly as much as others seem to, just because there's a lot of missed potential here. So at the end of my strongest IDs video, I made a joke about how Gregor has no ID that is fit to be considered among the strongest in the game. Well, it wasn't really a joke, it was kind of just true. And after Priest of La Mancha Gregor released, people told me that my opinion had become outdated. And I really do have to ask, are we using the same ID? He's certainly a good ID, and an excellent Blood Feast support for the other Blood Fiends, but the only super strong thing about him is just that. His Blood Feast support, and his skill 3, if you can manage to hold off on using it until you're on low HP and have 30 Bloodied Hand, which takes a while. First, you gotta ramp up your Ailing Heart to be able to use this effect on his skill 2 to hopefully get 9 Bloodied Hand per use, but even then you need to use your guard once, then wait a few turns to start getting this effect, or use your guard twice to get it immediately, but the way I see it, you're getting a ramped up skill 3 every other skill 3, which is not great. I know he's not really meant to be a damage dealer, and a lot of his strength comes from being an absolute tank, and I do think he's great for that. But standing among the strongest IDs next to the likes of Zwei Ishmael, nah. No way. With that being what it is, I like Priest Gregor quite a bit still. His Uptie 3 art is awesome, and I really like his weapon and animations, and his kit is still pretty good even with that long ramp up to his skill 3 reuse, but based on what people say about him, you'd think he's way better than he is right now. Maybe I'm missing something, and if I am, please let me know. For now though, he'll be a solid A tier. But you know who actually is worthy of being considered among the strongest? It's likely you've already heard about how good Fire Fist Gregor is, and that's all well and good. His clashable counter with a base power of 9 is already good enough to start the fights off to get sanity, but his stupid amounts of damage conditionals on the skill 3 shouldn't go overlooked as well. I actually don't care too much to talk about his kit, since it's pretty basic. But the real thing that makes his ID so good to me is his Uptie story and his art, which is obviously really good, but his Uptie story, which is just Gregor with nothing left to lose enacting revenge. But not to make himself feel better, no, just because he wants the Blood Fiends of La Mancha to hurt like hell for taking everything from him. It's a really interesting look into a vengeful Gregor we basically never get to see in any of his IDs. Edgar Air gets kinda close, but even that is more resigned misery as opposed to outright stone-cold rage like with Fire Fist. The thematics are on point, even being called Fire Fist Office Survivor Gregor instead of Fire Fist Office Fixer or something like that. It really drives home the hopelessness of this ID, and they put Choi Han through the ringer once again to voice this ID because my god he loves screaming. I'm really glad they decided to give Gregor the ID he deserves from a damage perspective, but also from a storytelling standpoint, and I'm glad I can end off my ranking of every ID with a very confident S tier. And that is every ID in Limbus Company reviewed in my extremely biased ways, except those IDs because look at just, they don't even really count as relate. Trust me, it's not important. I mentioned how my rankings for these IDs are arbitrary, but this tier list does serve a purpose outside of getting me flamed online, which of course, if you disagree with me, just for the record, this entire video is indeed rage bait specifically designed to make you mad, and my opinions are not my own. But I genuinely wanted to do these videos to get an idea of how good certain seasons of Limbus were in terms of ID design. So I will be assigning points to each tier. Since there are 6 tiers, the top tier for my favorite ID will score 6 points, and so on. In Harpooner Heathcliff's case, he would score 6 points for the Season 3 ID category, and that would continue downwards until we can get the average for each season. When you look at these statistics, bear in mind that IDs that were in the game on launch but are Season 1 are still included in the launch season category, so like Ting Tang Hong Lu, LCCB, so on. And to be honest, this is about what I expected outside of Season 4 being below Season 2 in terms of points, but that's probably mostly because of 2 certain banners that we don't talk about for different reasons. I went into this expecting Season 3 to come out on top since I remember it very fondly, and hey, that ended up being correct by a pretty good margin, though Season 5 also has really good IDs, and yeah, I know that the only Season 5 ID that's missing in these stats is Hong Lu, so fine. I'll throw him in there at an A tier, bringing the points of Season 5 to a nice clean 3.9 average score. I was also curious, and yeah, while Purgus knocked with a 4.2 average is not surprising in the slightest. So yes, the tier list format of this video did have a purpose, and I think it's pretty interesting to see how, very subjectively, the IDs of each season compare to one another, and also the general increase in quality, even if a few bad apples do stick out and kind of ruin the crowd. I hope both of these videos together get across just how much there is to talk about regarding not just the IDs in terms of gameplay, but everything. Since again, this isn't just how good each ID is from each season, it's how much I liked them. Frankly, I had a lot of fun with this concept, even if it did take, over like 30,000 words in a Google document and a long time to edit, but either way. Thank you for watching. And congratulations to me for finally getting through a recent video without mentioning Ring Yi Song. Oh, wait a second, guys.